Hello YouTubers. This is a special video where I get to show you a little library that I've been working on, around adding an extra layer of security to an existing API endpoints. Just to give you a little bit of, an overview here, when you're developing API endpoints in a particular microservice, there are some endpoints that are consumable by your clients, and there are endpoints that are consumable by other internal services to make sure that your existing API endpoint is in a healthy state. So for instance, for those of you who saw previous videos that I've posted on this channel, when we do end-to-end testing, when we try to, add a student to a database and then, modify the student, and then at some point in time we want to delete that student record. The operation of deleting a particular record in a particular system, especially if that system does not allow a hard delete to particular records, is very critical to be private and hidden and not exposed in any way, shape, or form. The problem with that is that a lot of people would say, well, you don't have to have an endpoint to clean up test data. Why don't you just go in the back end, and do it manually, or create an automated process that goes in the back end and tries to clean up that data? And that's fundamentally bad and wrong for many reasons. Let's open up the Blackboard here real quick, and let me just explain to you why this is a huge violation for so many things. So here's our board here. Let's just talk about a couple of principles in here. Assume that you have this microservice, this API here. And this API has a storage of some kind. This is the resource, and that's your storage. Let's say this is your SQL storage. And you have clients. You have mobile apps, desktop apps, all kinds of apps that are trying to consume your API endpoint. So these are my external clients. And these clients are trying to consume your endpoints. They're basically trying to, add students, modify student record, retrieve students, whatever the case may be. But then when you're building testing, right? So I'm going to go here and say test. When you're trying to build a test framework just to verify that your system is actually in a good state, I could put a little test entity in here. Give me a second. Yeah, let's just say this is my test here. Let's give it a proper color. Yeah, so these are my acceptance tests. And my acceptance tests are hitting the API endpoint, both private and public endpoints, to basically run through a full CRUD operation and ensure that the system is in a healthy state. So your end-to-end testing, they basically verify that if I am posting a student, the student actually gets persistent in the database. So that's the public endpoint that it's trying to test. But it's also a properly written test in the sense that it needs to go back and clean these records, especially if you're running these tests against an instance in production. Right, so you're running this against an API in production, and you want to make sure that the data that you create for testing in production, the automated test, is actually in a good state. A lot of people will say, well, why don't you just create an in-memory database and let that database disappear and just dispose the entire thing? That kind of denies the pattern of the whole idea of end-to-end testing, to know that all the pieces of your system are actually integrated with each other, because an in-memory database is not going to really tell me whether my API is truly connected to the actual storage and actual database that it's working with or not. So I'm just going to give this a little title in here. I'm going to call this is my end-to-end testing right here. The proper way is to go and say, I want to create records and I want to delete these records immediately. So here's my end-to-end testing right here. Okay. Now, what is the solution for this? There's a couple of concerns here. Of course, you add in your security layer, you could generate the tokens and all that kind of stuff. This is all great. And there are so many different capabilities, like you could put all your APIs in a virtual network and you put a gatekeeper in front of it, and the gatekeeper is the one determining, that gatekeeper pattern for microservices determines, whether, these microservices, which APIs of these microservices should be exposed, and then your internal test only runs within this virtual network. This is one way to do it. But what if your application was the API? So there's no gatekeeper in front of it, right? There's nothing in front of it to prevent anybody out there to actually interact directly with your API and try to do scanning, scan your API endpoints, scan your, to try to do discovery and try to ping every possible port and every possible combination of endpoints until they find the pattern. Of course, if you're following, there's a little problem with that, because if you're following the standard RESTful API standard when creating endpoints, it becomes a little bit more predictable, you know, to know that if you have slash API slash students, then if you're deleting a student, it's going to be slash delete slash API slash student ID. And if you want to pull all the student system, it's going to be slash API slash students, pull all the students, pull their IDs, and start deleting all of them. It becomes even more interesting when you have a delete all, but that's the non-production scenario. Now, the problem with what we're having in here is that we don't want, you know, a bad actor, you know, to come in and be able to access your API endpoint when they're doing discovery, or they're trying to scan your network and they're trying to discover what API endpoints are exposed. We want to make our API endpoints invisible, right? So if the person that's trying to access this API doesn't have the security token, like this is what happens today. If you don't have the security token, it'll say unauthorized. When a hacker looks at an unauthorized message, they basically say challenge accepted. I'll go and figure out a way to intercept any incoming calls to this API and basically steal the token, and now I'm into your system. A completely different story if a hacker, you know, tries to hit an endpoint and the endpoint says, I am not around, I'm not here. So how do we go about doing that? This is an idea that I had, you know, for a while now. I just wanted to have the time to implement it. One of the things that came to my mind is to be able to provide a header and a header value, and that header and header value will be examined by your API through a particular library, which is the library I'm going to talk to you about in a second. This library will intercept the call before it actually goes into your controllers or your API endpoints, and it will say if the incoming request doesn't have these particular values for the headers, then immediately report a false status that this URL doesn't exist. It's not there, it's a private endpoint, you can't really access it. So what does that really look like? You know, I mean, talk is cheap. You know, let's go ahead and start a brand new ASP.NET project. I'm going to make a quick project for you here, just so you can see how things look like and how you can configure this. You know, your experience developing this, you know, is my #1 priority. Your ability to be able to go and say, I want this to be as simple as possible. How do we go about doing that? Let's just start a brand new ASP.NET Core empty project right here. And let's call this, and I'm going to share this with you, all the links and all the libraries as usual. Everything is going to be shared with you. This is going to be hidden API demo. So I'm hiding API endpoints. The library is called Invisible API, but I'm giving it a different name so you just don't get confused between a demo project and an actual library. Okay, so here's a very simple project, and I'm going to go ahead in here and just create a controllers. Give me a second here. Let me increase the font. I always forget that one. I always forget that part. Let's increase the font here real quick. Here we go. All right. Here we go. And then this is okay, perfect. So here's the thing. So here's my new API, and I'm going to create a new folder in here. I'm going to call it controllers. And inside my controllers, I'm going to put in there a brand new controller. So this is a new item. And I want to add in there a controller. Let's search for a controller. API controller. Here you go, API controller. I hope it's the right template. Yeah, it's the right template. And then I'm going to call my controller here. Let's just call it students controller. Students controller. Okay, so this is students controller. Very simple API. And then in here, I'm just going to put an endpoint. And this endpoint doesn't really do much. I'm going to have it just return a message, right? This endpoint here will be /API/students, and it's a get endpoint. And then I'm going to add another endpoint that is delete, and then I'm going to show you how this invisible API actually works. So I'm just going to put in there maybe a value to ask of a string, and this is get, and then I'm returning OK, and here's my students. So just a simple API endpoint that basically returns a, sorry, it's not value task, action result. Right? And then I'm going to go and add another controller API endpoint in here. And this one this time is going to be returning, this is a delete, so HTTP delete, right? And I'm going to say delete. There's no implementation behind it, just for the purpose of this demo. So deleted all students, which is the part for the testing, right? So today, if I run this API, let's just go ahead in here and let's remove all of this and let's run this API real quick. Here we go. Let's spin up Postman here real quick, and let's hit that API endpoint. Here we go. So this is the URL. Here's Postman, like this. And let's just create a brand new one. So this is a get/API/students. And if I go and click get, it should say, did I not configure this properly? Give me 1 second. API controller, students controller, /API/students, right? And this is a get, and everything else is, I don't have any configuration here. It's really an empty services dot add controllers, I guess. I think that's pretty much all we need, I think. Let's see if we can run this real quick again and take a look at the endpoints. There we go. Let me steal this from another project. Let's take another project real quick. Here's an API. Here's startup CS. What do we need to add here other than, so add controllers, services add controllers, and then there's identity core, and then everything else is the same. All right, maybe I just need to get rid of the little map get thing. Instead of that, I want to say endpoints dot map controllers. I think that's what we need here. So this is, yeah, map controls. I think that's what it is. Okay, so let's just go ahead in here and run this again. Here we are. And this time I'm gonna hit Postman. So this is Postman in here, and I'm gonna try to hit /students. Here's my students. All right, we figured it out. Here's my students, right? And if I do delete, it will say, oh, you deleted all my students, right? Now what we want to do is that we want to allow one endpoint to be visible, and we want to hide the other endpoint unless there is a particular header value provided on top of this that would actually allow us to hide that endpoint except for particular clients. How does that work? If I go into my solution here, I developed this little library, really tiny library. It's an experimentational library that's called Invisible API. There it is, right? So this is Invisible API, and this Invisible API library is the easiest thing you can do to configure, and it's really important for your security work. Let's just go ahead in here and do this. Accepted all of this. Here we go. And then I'm gonna go configure this. So all you gotta do really, it's using middleware, right? So all you have to do is just to go and say app.use invisible API. If I do control period like this, it should be able to find it. This is gonna be in your configure method. Let's see, app.use invisible API. Let me pull in the reference. For some reason it's not able to. So let's see, invisible API. There it is. And then I think I still also need the extensions. Yeah, so this is the extension method. And then can I do that? Use invisible APIs. There it is. Right, so that's the library. Let me zoom in a little bit. So you go in here and say app use invisible API, and then all that you really need to provide is a list of invisible API configuration. So it's a list of invisible API configurations, just as straightforward as this. And in every single record of those, you have to go and create invisible API configuration, a new configuration. And this configuration will have all the information about the endpoint. So the endpoint that I want to hide is API/students. But that's not good enough because this URL is shared between two different HTTP verbs. So that doesn't cut it. Let's go ahead and add a couple other things. I want the verb to be delete, right? So for a particular endpoint that has delete, right, go ahead and say it is mandatory that it would have a header called, super secret header, and in the value, and you can of course, get this from a, key vault, whatever the case may be, and this here is super secret value. So now that that's it. That's all there it is. You just configured an endpoint. Of course, because this is a list, you can configure as many API endpoints as you want and have them report a false status that they're invisible, for a particular client or particular consumers of your API. Now, if I go and run this application right now, like this, watch the fireworks. So here's my guy here. Now if I go and call, let's go back to Git. Git should be working as expected. Oh, I have a little configuration error here. Just make sure that when you do API, you do this one little tiny slash here at the beginning. Here we go. So my API is running. Let's go to Postman. There it is. And if I'm hitting this Git, it will say here's my students, right? So this one is good, because I didn't configure anything for it. But if I go to the other one, which is the delete, and I click hit, it'll say 404 not found. I don't know this URL. This URL doesn't exist, right? In order for this URL to actually work, I have to go here and say super secret header. I think that's what I called, and then in here super secret value. Now if I do this, it says you deleted all my students. You basically, unveiled an API endpoint through particular header values. It's really, really important that you understand that this doesn't replace your existing security system. This is an added layer on top of your token-based security, or whatever security, pattern you're using, open API, whatever security pattern you're using. Please continue to use that, but it's really important that you add this additional layer on top, so someone scanning your API or trying to guess what endpoint they need to access, in order for them to have access to your API endpoints, definitely want you to try out Invisible API. Just a very simple idea. If I go back here into the Blackboard, the idea of it is really simple. Like I said, if you're not familiar with middleware in ASP.NET Core, and I'm going to provide you with the source code in a second, let's assume that this is your controller's layer. And let's assume that this is, this here is your middleware. It's called middleware because it literally lives in the middle between your application and the outside world. So let's say the request is coming like this. You can literally add as many in the pipeline. They call it a pipeline. You could add as many middleware layers as you go, and the order actually matters with these middleware. So in here, there's the middleware, and in here you have that controller that you have. And all that I'm doing here is that I'm going and saying, I'm going to add a middleware layer in here that's called Invisible API, that basically goes and looks at the configurations that you have and examines the incoming request from the outside world against your API configuration. And if these configurations don't match, it will hide completely your API endpoint and say, sorry, there's nothing that lives at this particular location. All right, for the people that are curious about how things work, right? At this point, you see how it is. It's very simple. You're gonna have the links and everything else in between in your in the description of this video. Now, for those who really care about how things work, if you go to my GitHub repo, you're gonna see something called Invisible API, which I just pushed like, less than 20 minutes ago, or 28 minutes ago, and you're going to see all the documentation about the patterns that should be used, right, from the beginning till the end. Something to notice in here, you're not supposed to have two things accessing two different consumers writing to your storage. So for the people that say, oh, let me just write an automated process that goes and deletes things from the database from behind, that goes behind the API and does that, that's bad. Don't do that. You should go through, there should be only one resource, one place that gives you access to the database. You shouldn't try to access the database from particular from different locations. That's a huge violation for architecture, API architecture best practices. Some people might argue for the read, not the write, but again, like I said, you want to keep all the communication going through your business logic layer, which is the API, to make sure that all the rules apply and all that kind of stuff. I talk a little bit in detail about how to do this. Of course, I'm going to show you how to set things up. I'm going to show you some examples, and that's really pretty much it. It's a very simple library, something for you to think about. If you're doing acceptance tests, it's really, really important that you think about hiding your API endpoints. And with that, I'm going to provide as much details in the description of this video. If you have any questions or comments or concerns, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. Tell me what you think about this idea. What could be risky about that idea? What could be a good advantage to take of this idea? It's just one of those little teeny tiny hackathons that I do every once in a while. I spin up a library and I try it with different applications and different projects and see how far it can go. Usually the applications that I build and the little libraries that are built is something that I'm building for myself, a tool that I'm building for a particular project that I'm working on with other people or by myself, and I need that kind of capability that I can't find anywhere else. So I go and build the library and just offer it to the world to just take a look at, and maybe someone out there will have interest to look at the library and say, yeah, I actually like this library. I wanna use it. Maybe it's useful for me, and maybe it's not. What are the possibilities of hiding API endpoints? What can be done? You don't want a hacker to say, oh, this endpoint says unauthorized, so all I need to do is to go find the token. You want a hacker to hit your endpoint, and the endpoint will say, no, I don't exist. I am not here. So they stop trying to access your API endpoint. So if you have any questions or comments or concerns, please feel free to drop a comment in the comment section, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching.